Yeah, I think we're ready. Finally.
All right. Why don't you do the introductions?
Well, I am Rick Sinclair. And with me is Curtis Jung. We're digital consultants, Marklin digital consultants for the Marklin product line, Marklin LGB Tricks. And this webinar is going to be on basically S88 contacts. What we've been doing is we've kind of been going through what we think is logically and starting from setup of a Central Station 3 to getting it to hopefully where you can do some basic routing. So far, we've covered a few topics, and now we're on contacts, which we will explain how to set up a S88 or a Link S88.
All right, so maybe we just give them a quick rundown on the two topics of setup that we covered on the last two webinars.
All right, go ahead.
You don't remember the first one? The first one was it was
locomotives.
First one was how to enter locomotives.
Yes.
Into your CS3. Some basics. The very first webinar, admittedly, is a little disjointed, so you don't have to focus on that. We have had issues. Just that was our first one. The second webinar was adding articles, I believe, which are known as, they call them articles, but they were turnout signals and just basic solenoid accessories like that. Okay, I think that's it, right, Rick?
The last one we didn't do M83s and M84s, so it was adding articles.
No, I think we did add M83. We covered it roughly.
Okay.
So we're probably going to go over at least K83s or M83s and M84s. What the next session, I believe, is what's scheduled.
Yes. So. Yes, that's next.
Well, just get one quick question from Merle. He said we are not affiliated with the ETE Zoom calls, so no. We are. No. It's a different channel altogether. We don't do these weekly. It's a monthly basis. So, yeah. All right, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, we have another question. Where are we located in the USA? Well, I'm down in Southern California. Curtis is in Northern California in the Bay Area, but I travel up there. I was up there last weekend. There was a chance where we would have done this seminar from his place, but I came home, so that didn't happen. I think we can click off that. Done. Okay, so there's basically what we want to cover is, like we said, S88 contacts, how to set them up, the S88s, and how to set up the contact so it will read contact into your central station, which is the first step in doing some automatic routing or events in the Central Station 3. So there's basically three kinds of contacts. There's a read contact where a magnet on one of the cars activates the contact, which makes it a momentary contact. There is a circuit track, which is a little flipper switch on Marklin's C track or M track or K track, which is, again, the slider activates it. It's a momentary contact. Or a contact track where you make the entire rail a contact and it shows occupancy and you get an entry and exit trigger.
Let me quickly display a circuit track here. So just
yes. So first off is a read contact, which this is a standard LGB read contact, and it will go right in between the ties of an LGB track, and the wires will go back to the Central Station 3. And you put a magnet on the bottom of the locomotive, and it will activate the read contact and show that there is occupation for a split second, obviously, because this is a momentary contact. Being that the locomotive is moving, the read contact only closes the 2 points when a magnet is above it. The same thing in HO. You can use small read contacts that you can get from different manufacturers. Marklin makes them. Marklin makes them for C and M track and for Tricks 2-rail track. Then you still need a magnet on a car or a locomotive. There's a circuit track, which Curtis has an illustration of a circuit track.
That should be
This
it there.
is a circuit track for Marklin C-track. And again, it comes in K, and you can still find them in M on the secondary market. But and the slider will activate the little trigger there. And what's convenient about this is it's directional. One direction you can have on one contact. The other direction you can have on a different contact. So it does, it could be used conveniently for directional events. And the third contact, which is the one we prefer and use most, it's a contact track where you insulate one rail of C track or K track. It doesn't work in two rail operation. So LGB and Trix track, it's not possible to do. So in Marklin, it's very convenient because it shows occupation, and you will get a entry and or an exit trigger, which is very convenient when you're doing events.
We can explain that further.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that. So now we're gonna get into making a C-track contact. Is that what we're doing next?
No. Do you want to cover? Should we cover the S88 types first?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Go right ahead.
All right. So there are essentially now there are older users may be familiar with this box here. This is an old S88 unit. It came under two model numbers, 6088 or 6088O, I believe. And that uses the connection plug here. It's a 6-pin plug that went to the underside of Essential Station 2. So these plug differences here are what's different between a 6088 and a 6088O part number. Newer ones, the newer units, there are 3 different types depending on, let's say, the CS3 controller and even a CS2 for that matter. If you have a CS2 or the CS3, there are 2 different CS3s, a CS3 and a CS3 Plus. The CS3 and the CS2 will probably use the new S88 links. Well, not new, it's been around for a while. We do kind of abbreviate this to an S88, but essentially it's an S88 link. I mean, we refer to this to an L88.
L88.
An L88 because it's a link model and it's just an abbreviation. We'll get back to this in a second because there are 2 different other types. The for 2 rail users, there is an S88 DC model. That's on there. And then typical ones for most HO users or 3 rail guys will use the S88 AC. So you can see there's an 88 AC model and an S88 DC model. And essentially the same types of plugs. The difference is we do have RJ45 Ethernet cable links to connect and daisy chain these together, whereas older S88s had a short ribbon cable here. So you don't have this ribbon cable. You use RJ45 connection points. Now back to the L88, the link. This is the other one. This one is also more or less developed for backward compatibility. You have the 6-pin connector here, and that's a better picture of it, so you can actually see what it looks like. That matches up to the S88s. So if you're going to use these, or you have a bunch of these and don't want to sort of toss them, you are required to get an S88 link. This also requires, when you have this, not compared to the S88 AC or DC, this requires a switch mode power pack because it needs a separate power supply. Your additional connections, so you have what they call bus lines. So if you're going to connect S88 links, the older S88s, to this is the bus 3 connection. But if you use the 2 newer ones, you can use the bus 1 and 2. That's to expand the 16 inputs here that you have on each of these devices. One thing you want to be aware of is there is a voltage switch here. It's a 12 volt to 5 volt switch. The 12 volt is for using the newer buses here. If you are using the older bus or a combination of these two, it has to be switched to 5 volts. The Link 88 connects to the 7-pin port on the back of either device, CS3, CS2, or CS3 Plus. However, the CS3 Plus has a direct connection and is really not required for this. Now, again, this is for backward compatibility. But if you're using all new S88 units and you have a CS3 Plus, you don't need a link. You could just get by with using all the new S88 modules, an AC or DC, depending on your rail configuration. I think I'm going to toss it back to Rick because he did have pictures to show the connection points on a CS3.
Yes. Share screen.
Sean quickly asks, so what is the difference between S88 Link and S88 AC? Essentially, they're both AC units. It's just that the Link has more compatibility for older devices.
Okay, so getting into how to make a C-track.
No, show the connections for the Central Station 3 and the 3 Plus.
Oh, that's right. That's the different one. Okay, good, because I'm not quite ready. Okay, what I have, I can only find an example of the CS3. Can you see the back of the CS3 there? Are you seeing that, Curtis?
Yes, I am. It's being displayed.
Okay. So I'm sorry, this is a CS3 Plus. I only have the back of the CS3 Plus. I couldn't find a good image of the back of the CS3. So the Plus has different port configurations. It has 3 different ports: a 7-pin, what is it, the 9-pin, and 6-pin. So the 7-pin would be for your CAN bus, a 60145, I believe it is, CAN bus extension to add more mobile stations, more boosters. If you have just one booster, you plug it in there. But the difference between a CS3 and a CS3 Plus is the Plus gives you the RJ45 port on the bottom for the S88. So your S88, not a Link, but your regular S88 will plug directly into the bottom of your CS3, and it does not need a power supply for a standard S88. Now, a Link S88, which needs a power supply, will plug into your 7-pin connector right in the center. And on a CS3, a standard CS3, there are 2 of these ports. And that allows you to plug in a booster and your Link S88 into the back of it. That was an improvement over the CS2. The CS2 only had 1 of the ports. But also on the bottom, because you're required to use a Link S88, a CS3 does not have this port on the bottom for a S88, because you're required to use a Link with the 7-pin. So that's the difference between CS3 and CS3 Plus, if that was clear at all. If you have, basically, if you have a CS3, you need a Link. If you have a Plus, you do not need a Link.
And just to clarify and make sure people understand, the RJ45 connection is an Ethernet cable.
Yes. Now, if you want to take it for a moment, there is a graphic I need to pull back up. I need to find and pull back up for the next demo.
All right. Okay. So next thing is we're going to explain most of the focus that we do. I think a lot of us are familiar with how to connect a circuit track, and let me just show a quick graphic here. So let's get organized a little bit. The circuit tracks here. This picture is a little fuzzy. All right. Hide that window. So this is the underside of a circuit track. So this middle section here is where the flipper is. That's the slider contact. That's this very area here. And your connection points, depending on which direction, and you see these connection tabs here and here, are mainly your direction connections. And you can see there is this red wire under here is your ground reference connection to a circuit track. So that needs to be established on the circuit track. Am I kind of going out of order? Do we need to figure out how to connect these S88s first?
No, not yet. Just show the connection,
okay.
And I will show how to make a C-track contact track. And the reed switch is pretty self-explanatory.
Okay. All right. So basically, just in short, and then we'll kind of get back to this later, this blue wire is what will actually be connected to your S88s when you're doing the hardwire connections. So are you set? We'll kind of go back to you.
Yeah, I'm set.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so we have a question, which is a very good question. Please let us know how to make a contact track from K-track as well. K-track already has the two rails insulated from each other. So all you need to do is make sure that you don't have continuity all the way through with the joiners to the next piece of track, and then attach a wire to that insulated rail, which is C-track. You have to slightly modify the track, which is very slight. First, you have, you want to show the circuit tracks, the factory circuit tracks? I'm sorry, contact tracks?
The factory contact tracks, yes, I will. All right, let me get to my folder with pictures here.
There's two ways you can do it. You can use the factory contact track pieces and then insulate all the rails in between it, or you can just make your own and use insulators. There's two ways you can do it.
So I'll show you two pictures here, or I'll show you one picture and a video image. So there's the picture.
There you go.
Yeah.
So 24995, it's already made at the factory with the insulated section, and there's the little white dot with the blue arrow in it that will, that's where the brake is in the track, and everything inside the brake will
right
be insulated.
If you can see that red line, there's a gap in the track.
Yeah, there's a gap in the track.
Right
and
here.
That insulates the rails in between those two rails. Unfortunately, C-track, if you have a piece of track in between it, then the electricity will find its way through because those two rails are connected electronically or solidly, whatever you want to call it. What you have to do is you have to cut C-track underneath. And what you will have to do is, if you can see the directions there, there's a little bridge that joins the two tracks together, and you cut the little bridge, and then you fold the little piece down. This says to cut it out with two cuts, but you can do it with just one cut with a pair of diagonal cutters, small pair. And here's an example of a picture I took. Basically, you give it one snip and then bend the little tab down, and that insulates one rail from the other. And so the insulated rail will become your track contact to the S88. And it's convenient because it gives you the little feed tab. So you use a spade connector and slide it right on, right next to the arrow, to the left of the arrow, and run that back to your S88. And there you've made a contact track. Now you do this for several pieces of track, and each rail will be insulated from each other. You again need to put the insulators on, which Curtis will show right now. The pack of insulators.
Yep,
74030.
coming up here. Share.
There you go. You slide the little insulators over the sections of track to insulate the outer rail from getting electricity from the next piece of track. And your two rails are insulated then.
Let's see if I have a photo here.
There you go.
So there's an idea of how to do that. So this is a short section of contact track. You probably want to make them longer than this for reasons I can explain later. But essentially, when you have a bare piece of track that is unclipped, your two outer rails are actually connected. They're one rail. They're just one giant rail. But when you isolate it, you need to be sure that you insulate the same rail side, because we've done this a couple times in sort of absent-minded thinking. We'll have one piece of track, and looking at it from the top, we're connecting this insulator on each end, and it ends up being a split rail and not properly insulated.
Yeah.
Well, we'll go over that later in a bit.
And you can see there where your blue wire connects with the spade connector to the insulated track. It's very convenient and handy, and it's nice and clean and easy to do. You don't have to solder anything. All you do is
this
put the spade
contact rail
connector on for C track.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So with that, we can get into the configuration of L88s and S88s.
Okay, so but before we do that, I do want to go through a bit of a procedure here, maybe tackle a question here. Let's see, where was it? Question: a combination of older and newer devices is any better for feedback? For CS2 or CS3? Speed wise, okay, so a CS2 or CS3, CS2 essentially has a slower processor, but the timing cycle, the interval cycle, so what it does is it's constantly looping through your central station, and you can actually alter that to some degree if you're getting maybe too much response from a circuit. Rarely used it, but we do use it occasionally. So for instance, if the loop cycle time is, like 200 milliseconds, and you have a train that ends up sort of dirty wheels or whatnot, creates what we call a double trigger. It triggers an event twice. You can maybe hold that off sometimes by extending that cycle time so it misses one of those, the static dirt. As far as the newer and the older devices, I kind of think that the newer ones are a little beneficial because you can actually set it up for a higher voltage. It's a 12-volt setting for the new S88s. You're limited to 5-volt settings on the older S88s. Who knows? There could be digital noise that gets involved if you have a large layout. Blue arrow track. Let's see. Could you make a do-it-yourself blue arrow track using a normal half track and a Dremel grinding wheel?
We just kind of covered that. Well,
yeah, we'll get over that.
In K-Track, yes. Yes, in K-Track,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you can always cut rails. Making a contact track out of a whole piece of track is actually easier, and to some degree, it's more beneficial to have a longer length contact track than it is a shorter length contact track. So, if you've got room for the whole track, why cut it when you can just extend the length of it?
Yeah, depending on what you're doing, whether it's your Schottenbahnhof, or is it a just to show if there's clearance past a turnout, or is it the entire block, which would be kind of inconvenient, but you can. Yeah, it depends on how you're using it.
Okay. What is the ideal length of contact track? That is going to vary depending on uses. Again, when you make contact tracks, it serves as it actually has two major purposes. One is occupation or a trigger, which when I say trigger, it activates an event script. And so you can have various, they're going to vary depending on what your use is. But overall, again, longer is going to be better than shorter. And I can maybe cover that in a bit, but let's not go over that. I do have a couple more questions from the YouTube feed. Do you have to cut the bridges on both sides of the C track? Yes, you have to cut the bridges on. So for instance, let's kind of show this track here. So you see this here's, I'm using insulated rails. Okay, so however many tracks you put in between, you're going to have to cut the bridges on each end, because if you just cut it on one, you're still getting a circuit feed that will loop around to the other side. So yeah, cut both ends of the bridges, and the more tracks, you're going to have to cut more of those tracks if your insulated sections are further apart. So right now I just have a single piece of track. I typically will use two, just for reasons I can get into later. What is the maximum length of insulated track to avoid disturbances? I don't know if I have a maximum length. I mean, really, when you're talking about length and issues like that, it's an issue more or less of what your track feed situations. If you don't have enough power feeds to the track, basically your digital signal is getting degraded. But as far as contact tracks, I mean, shoot, what's the longest I've used? I think I use occupation track in my hidden yard, and they're about 4.5 feet long.
Yeah, that's about as long as a friend of ours is using. They're yeah, about the same.
Okay, so we do have some advanced questions through the feed. I think we're going to get to those a little bit later. So Ton, I think that's how it's pronounced. We'll get back to you on that question.
Yeah, that's not in this seminar.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not creating events yet. We're not showing how to do that because we need to get S88 contact tracks, get people to know how to use those first.
Yeah. Okay. So all right. So we'll get back to some of these questions here right now. The purpose, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show when you set up a contact track, I'm going to give you an idea of a quick way to test these contact tracks. So the first thing I'm going to show here, what you're going to need, and what I use, track's falling off the desk here, is I use a digital voltmeter. And you can use an analog meter, but a digital voltmeter has what we call a continuity test. And it's, it can also be the diode test. You can use resistance test, but with a continuity tester, when I attach my two probes together, and hopefully you can hear this.
Yeah, we're good.
Right, so you can hear that. So what we do is, sorry, give me a sec. My demo track is kind of falling on the floor here. So this is an uncut section of track. All right. So what I'll do is I'll take a probe and I'll put a probe on one rail. And just to show you guys, an uncut piece of track will have continuity on both sides. Okay. So regardless of where I am, these rails are one continuous contact point. Right. Got that. And there's the gap is right here. So you can see them sliding over. Okay. So this is an uncut piece of rail. The next piece is we'll use the track connection pieces. That's the ones with the gap here. So these icons right there, you can see it. That's your gap. That means that this center rail, this top rail, is what's insulated. And I can prove that to you. I'll put my probe to the bottom rail again. And you can see I have connection all the way through to each end. All right. But on the top, actually, let's do it this way. So from the bottom to the top of this center track, which is cut, I get no tone. Okay. And I won't get tone along this whole upper rail. And that's the nature of these pieces of track. It does insulate these two rails. But from the top, Again, the top is the insulated rail. Excuse my hands being in the way. There's really no way to do this unless I have another camera. So this is one rail because it's the isolated rail, and it's going to go all the way here. And here's the gap. It stops with the tone. Okay. So I'm using a continuity beep here. But if you're using a resistance setting, you're going to go from 0 resistance to an infinite or an overload over limit reading if it's a digital meter. It's a very high resistance because there's no current flowing from this rail to this section. All right. The last part is 3 sections of track again, and you can see that, hopefully you can see here, I actually have an insulated rail. That's that red piece right there. And it's over here as well, right there. Sorry, a little focusing camera there. And again, because I've cut the rail on this center piece of track here, I'll have the same readings. This bottom rail is the uninsulated rail, so it's going to be one continuous power. That's where your power joint's from. And then the top is not going to have connectivity to the bottom rail. And again, this is my cut rail right here. Okay, you see how it stops right there? That's the gap, that's where it stops. So this is how you know physically to test your contact tracks before you end up, you know, after you do your wiring, and you want to test to make sure that it's properly insulated. One of the issues you may have, again, is when you, instead of having your insulators on the same rail side, you put one on the opposite side. And this will happen more than you realize because, you know, you get mixed up when you're doing this sometimes. So again, that's how you check and do a test. Okay. All right.
We have a question. Do you recommend soldering a diode across the tracks? Don't know that we need to.
No, I haven't found a use for it, or really, I haven't found it really necessary unless you can think of a reason why. It's basically how a contact track works is, and you may know this already, is that on your isolated rail, that's the top rail, you're going to connect the bottom rail to your S88. And what happens is when your wheels make contact, it closes this circuit from one rail to the other. So it's taking that live rail feed from this rail and it's jumping it over and sending a circuit signal to the S88. And a diode really isn't necessary because, you know, essentially it's the same current as you're getting over here. You're just kind of closing that gap.
Right.
Okay. All right, so where are we on this discussion? Any questions? Insulated rail section. I think we've answered that. Can just using reed switches provide the same control as contact tracks?
I answered that.
As far as triggers,
yes.
Basic triggers, there's a yes and no component. It depends on whether or not you want to regulate controls based on the length of a train, for instance, because you got to remember the reed switches are only activated as long as the slider makes contact, whereas a contact track will remain active. It has an arrival point where the first wheels of the train make contact with the track and will stay on until that last wheel on the caboose or the end of the train departs or leaves that track. So they're known as arrival and departure triggers. Okay, you don't have that luxury with the circuit track, because again, a circuit track is, I mean, a slider on a circuit track, your slider only makes that much contact more or less. And then if you have a locomotive that has 2 sliders, then you're actually creating a situation where you might be activating an event twice, which could be problematic. And again, yeah, Rick answered, contact tracks again will also give you another state of track occupancy. As long as the train is on a contact track, you can use that to set up conditions for activating events. You can't really do that with the slider unless you're very precise on where that train stops. And, you know, I can't stop a train in a two inch area.
All right, let's get into configuration of the S88s and L88s.
All right. Let's
You're
see.
ready to do that.
So I just want to see, we got some YouTube questions, I think.
Okay.
Okay, we answered that one. Centimeters, not familiar with inches and feet. For centimeter track, like I said, 2 sections of track, you can use two 172 pieces. That's 144 millimeters. Is that right? Yeah, 140 millimeters. Using a 097, a 97, or a 94 millimeters piece of track may not work. And part of the issue is that when you have a contact track like this, and you think about how far apart your wheels are on a passenger car, for instance, right? Your wheels might be this. So if this is, let's say an exaggerated version, this is the wheels on my passenger car, this is my contact track. I'll get a trigger here, but as my train goes over, it's going to turn off that trigger. And then it's going to trigger again when my rear wheels connect on it. So what you want to do is you want to make sure your contact track is at least a little bit wider than the wheelbase on your longest car. Hopefully that makes sense. 4.5 feet. Yeah. Somebody answered a question for us. Thank you for that. Okay, we can probably move on. So is it to me?
Yeah. Yeah. You have the L88 and S88.
Okay. So what I will show here is, let me show the Central Station 3 screen. It's a default screen. I already have a piece of track that's sort of wired and set up using an L88. So let's go to the share screen mode. Okay, let's see if I can blow this up a little bit. Okay, and Rick, you'll just monitor the questions here.
Yes.
All right, so the first thing you want to do, obviously I have a straight piece of track here. I don't have anything connected to it. And we're going to add an S88 contact. So, you know, obviously if you're familiar with the interface, I can click here to add an article, or if you click the edit button up here at the top, I can click add article. And I will select an S88 contact at the bottom. Okay, and you can see there's already a device connected here. Rick and I had a bit of a discussion, so we'll probably get to that. There's a little bit of confusion under this device setting here. Let me see if I can annotate with this working here. So we have a device setting up at the top, and we have a switch to setting here at the bottom. Right now, don't even consider this. I don't really use this myself, but there is, it does do something. So let me get back to that in a second. Clear these drawings. Depending on the S88 you're using, the one thing you need to set up is you need to set up the device type. So by default, it will probably look like this: controlling contacts. And we're looking at the top left here. So because I'm connected to a Link 88, an S88 one, I'm going to collect one because that should be the one that's actually activated on the layout here. So it automatically adds this, and I can obviously, you can change the contact name. K1 works just like anything else, as long as you understand that this is a contact label. The next thing, the default setting for anything that's directly connected to an S88 link, you're not going to use the bus connections here, 1, 2, or 3. You're going to actually set it for direct. Okay, and what it does is it grays out this module setting here. It grays out the module setting. And you're going to have only 16 contacts on the L88 because you usually only have one L88 connected. Once you add S88s to your L88 is where you're going to start to use the bus options. And just to remind you, let me just stop sharing the screen here. On your L88, this is it. We have 16 inputs.
Those are direct.
These are direct. These are your direct inputs. And this inverted, this is sort of a rail icon. For lack of trying to describe, it's an inverted T. You have one on each end. And only one of these, no matter how many of these you have connected, you have to connect at least one of these to a brown or outer rail of your layout. So it needs to be connected to the brown wire feed from the CS3, because this is what we call the reference ground. So everything bases itself on this. So like if this was a 0 voltage setting, right, on your reference ground, anything that's activated by one of these inputs has something to compare it to. The bus setting that I'm referring to are these top connections. And I'm sort of reading this backwards, but I believe this is bus 1, bus 2, and bus 3. Okay, so this, you kind of have to remember this. So I may have jumped ahead. Let me go back to my screen here. Okay. Share screen. So when you're adding devices or you're adding contacts, remember direct is going to be anything that's connected to a K1 input. And see, let's do, so let me get out of this really quickly because I do need to show another section. Now there are actually multiple areas that you do have to configure S88s. Looks like it's reading in my S88 here. Oh, it's reading in a locomotive. Okay.
Blinky.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm gonna, while this is going on in the background, I can kind of show you. I'm gonna click on my system link here at the top left. And if you don't see this window, you just need to click on the CS3 icon and that'll get us to the, let's see, I don't know what that says. My German's terrible. So what I'm going to do is there are a couple of areas here that we have to kind of consider looking at. One is going to be the Link S88 if you're using a Link S88. And that's, we need to go down here at the Link S88. Now, you may have recalled that I selected the Link S88 one. That's because my central station here has been connected to a different S88 that I'm using elsewhere. You can see that the green check means, I believe, I don't know if that's the one that's currently activated. That's the one that's currently connected. Okay, so this is the one I actually need to configure because it's the one that's connected to my CS3. This other one that's now grayed out is not connected. So I'll have to go back into the configurations that we were at previously and reset those. So forgive me for being out of order there. However, we want to go into the settings and we want to review these really quickly. So you can see the name here is S88.2. You can edit that. You can change the name so it's a little clearer for whatever you want if you need to. You can see there are single settings. Keyboard settings we won't go into. I haven't really touched those. However, the main thing that you need to look at here is that when you connect multiple S88s to a Link 88 using the bus connections, we have what we call length. These are bus lengths. And you can see that they're all set for 0. Right? You can see right here. Right here, they're all set for 0. Once you start adding devices to any of those connections, you're going to have to go into this setting and you're going to have to change this value. So in other words, if you're on bus 1 and you're connecting one S88 to your Link 88, this number has to be changed. Okay, so you just need to click on it. You can just edit the number. If you have numbers in here, you don't really have connections to it, it's not going to harm the system. The thing is, if you added units and these are all staying 0, you're probably going to give us a call and going, hey, my S88s aren't working. Well, this is one of the primary reasons, is that the bus length was not properly set. remember when I previously mentioned cycle times, and let me scroll up a little bit. And you can see here, these cycle times are the repeat cycle of the central station you're reading each of your bus inputs on your layout. So right now they're set for 100 milliseconds. If you want to experiment running them longer, you can. There's no harm in doing that. These are probably the only two configurations that I've ever adjusted. I don't really mess with the bit time. Not really too sure what the cycle time maybe is looking at that point, but there's something to play with.
Explain the bus lengths, if you can. Like if you have 5 old S88s, what do you set bus 3 to?
Okay, yeah. So, and that's what I thought I explained, but it's okay. Yeah, if you connect 5 S88s to the bus 3, that's the 6-pin connector, and you can kind of see that written here. If you can't see it, let me point it out to you. Whoops, lost the annotation button. Spotlight, where'd it go? Oops. Right here. This here says 6-pin. That's the 6-pin input. If you have 4 S88, so you want to connect an old system, then what you're going to do is you're going to change your bus length to 5 because you have 5 units that you're connecting it. This way, the CS3 accounts for like the module numbers that you may be familiar with. So the first connected item to a bus is going to be module 1. Your second one is going to be module 2, inputs 1 through 16. And, if you have 5. So hopefully that explains everything when you have devices. Okay. What are you kind of getting at, Rick? Maybe
No. Well, a gentleman asked S88 bus lengths. If I have 5 read relays, I have to set it to 5. No,
that is incorrect. The relays that you're talking about, your S88s have 16 inputs. And those relays that you're talking about you're connecting to which inputs on those devices. What the length is actually referring to is they're actually referring to the S88 box itself, the entire box. So if you have a single S88 added to it, it's basically the first box that you're adding to it. And therefore the bus length would need to be set to 1. If you have 2 S88 boxes, and we're not talking about the independent inputs on the boxes, we're talking about the entire number. Those, you're going to have to increase that bus length according to how many you have. Now, for instance, or another example is, let's say you have multiple systems and you just happen to be running an S88 AC and a S88 DC, and you're connecting them both to bus 1. Well, then your bus length would need to be 2 to account for the AC and the DC. If you have, let's say, 1 AC and 2 DCs, your bus length has to be 3. Okay. So hopefully that kind of clarifies that question.
Yeah, I guess basically however many modules you have connected to that bus, that's what you set the length to.
Yeah. Gary Adams asked, if you're using the S88 Link and the old S88s, then what number? Okay, so the thing is, the S88 itself is going to, or the Link 88 is going to have 16 inputs, and that's a direct input. There is no bus length that you have to worry about that. For however many old S88s you connect to that, that's where you got to set the bus length number. So yes, your Joe says it's the same number. As long as you know how many you have, if you have 5 connected S88s to a Link 88, for instance, then the length has to be 5. This goes for the same as like a CS3 Plus. When you connect it underneath, that's the first item that you connect to is going to be bus 1 because you're not using a Link S88. Okay, so that might be a little confusing. We can always clarify that in an email if you actually whenever you get to that point. The other area here on this left column is, so like I said, we're looking at the Link S88 configuration. The other one that you may have to look at is the TFP3 configuration, and I'm clicking on it now. Okay, and the thing is, this is sort of the CAN bus, and I believe it actually may be relating to, let me go to the settings. This also has a length, and this GFP is more likely the setting used on the underside of a CS3 Plus. It's a direct, it's not going through a Link 88. It's being connected directly into the CS3 Plus, and you can see this one's got a bus setting of 5. This is a setting that's used on my layout. I did change the cycle time to increase to see if I could eliminate one of these tracking errors that I had. It helped somewhat. I didn't reset it. However, the layout's working fine. So again, when you're changing a bus length, you might have to change both. Again, it won't harm you to have a higher number in this bus length number. It only is detrimental if the number is too low for the amount of devices you have connected. So this is through the system configuration. So you're going to have to configure this to make sure that they operate correctly in your article list. Now let's get back to this K1 contact here. And you can see what I did was at the top, my Link S88 was the incorrect device because that was not connected. So I do have to switch this to the S88 input. And look, it disappeared. So let's see here. So this is one thing that Rick and I were sort of discussing before the meeting because it was a little confusing. The Link 88 device up here, this menu over here, will display a list of anything that's connected to the Link S88 or whatever's listed in this device setting. So in other words, if I set my GFP32 here, I don't have anything connected to that input, so it's all blank. I configured that contact to an S88 which is why it's displayed here. But considering that the S88 is the incorrect device, and I change it to Link S88 it's not being displayed. So the issue here is that I need it displayed before I can switch it to the correct contact point. And you can see down here in the lower right, it says switch to. It means I'm switching this contact configuration from being read from S88 and I need to switch it so it's being read on the Link S88-2. Okay, and you can see it disappeared from this device setting. I'll show it to you really. So it disappeared from this device setting of S88 but now, and this is really kind of confusing to follow, and unfortunately that's the UI. If I click on the Link S88 it is now in this list. Okay, so now I can do my proper configuration. My bus setting is direct because it's connected to a Link S88. And my contact number, it's the first contact. And I don't really need to worry about this controlling contact anymore because it was already set. I'm going to add another device on a non-existent bus. So what happens is I'm going to add 2, but this is actually going to be, so it's going through my S88, but now let's say I'm going to connect it to an S88 that's connected to a bus number. Rather than being direct, now again, direct is only going to be the first 16 contacts on the Link S88. Any added devices is going to be used on a bus contact. And so for instance, if I connected an S88 to the Link 88 on bus 1, it has to be set for bus 1. That's this setting here. And it's the first module. Okay, you can change modules. Now, this setting here, just so to clarify it, module 1 is going to cover contacts 1 through 16. Okay, and once I go to the next module, I have to change this. And module 2 is again only going to have available to it contacts 1 through 16, and so on and so forth. So for each of these modules, you have 16 selections to go through. And I'll just kind of go up these numbers here. 15, 16. See, it doesn't go any higher than 16. Then you have to switch modules, and then you can do the same procedure. Okay. Now let's quickly get rid of this because this will just be garbage. I can get out of edit mode. And my contact now is in my article list, and that's what we're looking at here. Now, if you're familiar with this, you can click on this top where it says view, and I can isolate S88 contacts, which is kind of pointless for this visual display because it's such a simple layout. But if you need to sort of sort out where all your contacts are, just click on this view button here, and it will isolate all your contacts in the article list, and that's this list here. Okay. To add it to the layout, you need to go to the edit button and click on edit trackboard page. Okay. And you need to click on the article here or just drag it down. And that's what I'm doing here. And I'm just placing it on my track. Okay. And you can obviously, you can move this wherever you want it. You cannot change the size of this contact. Unfortunately, it would be cool if you could, but we can't. So that's how you add it into a layout. Let's go back into these features here. I just want to go back into the edit article list. Now, you can see here, if I select this, which is already selected, you can change the type of contact it is. So if you have a magnetic reed switch, you can change the icon. Or if you're using a contact track or circuit track, forgive me, you switch it to switch track. And just remember that when you have a switch track, it's a single piece of track, but it has 2 contact connections to an S88. So you'll probably add 2 of these into your layout here, depending on your use. So I'll divert that back to contact track. Now, we can go around to testing how to test this. Okay. Let's see if I can click it. So right now in the gray state, this is unoccupied. And let's pull up a locomotive that I have on track. Okay, right now my train is not on a piece of track, and it's the same sort of configuration that I was displaying earlier. It's 3 sections of track. There's a middle section of track. And I'm going to roll this train forward a bit and hopefully not make a fool of myself. Oops. Dirty track. All right, you see how it changed yellow? And it changed gray because my train rolled off the end. Okay, and that's what a contact track does. As long as the train is on that track, it's going to display yellow. Once it rolls off, dirty track, it will go back to gray. Okay, so let's kind of hold the demonstration here, and we'll ask some questions or take some questions on.
Yeah, I accidentally clicked the wrong button. I was going to answer in a text, but a gentleman says I have K-Track and my layout has 10 turnouts. Do I use an M83, M84 or Link S88? You would not use a Link S88. You would use an K83 or an M83 for turnout control. How's that?
And just to kind of clarify, the Link 88 is really just a feedback module. It's to indicate where trains have made contact with your layout, sort of a positioning marker. And a lot of people want to use these contact tracks for, just rerouting trains and whatnot. And there's some details on that. I'm not going to answer yet or go into that right now. Let's go to other questions here. Status inquiry interval. What exactly is the status inquiry interval? Gee, I don't know where that was labeled. Did you see that in
That's in the S88 configuration page, I believe, in the
yeah, that's pretty much your feedback loop cycle. Because what happens is it's the one area where I was mentioning it was set for 100 milliseconds. Let me see if I can get back to that screen.
Which wouldn't that be a tenth of a second? Every tenth of a second it looks for contact.
Yeah. So and there are instances where it could be too short, especially if you have like dirty wheels, dirty track, it might double trigger. Do you have any questions on the feed that you can read? I'm going to look through quickly the YouTube feed.
No, we're good on questions at this moment.
Okay.
Either we've explained everything, so there's no questions, or we've lost them and they're not asking.
Yes. And let's see. I use contact, and sometimes when I turn my system on, the icon on my trackboard defaults to yellow without a train on it. I just click and it goes to the gray and does work. Yes, this does happen. I think every once in a while, I think I've clicked on it and they've shown red. Can't really explain why that happens. Just something that I haven't troubleshot. Doesn't happen enough. It's very infrequent. But going yellow, it can happen a lot. Doesn't really affect anything. You might have to default it. Hopefully, your layout's not too sensitive. Sometimes it can be. It's all on event scripts. And we'd love to go into event scripts, but that really is sort of another topic because it's all about how to use those triggers and what they do. I will quickly explain. I think probably it's beneficial to explain the 4 states of sensor.
One thing that might be happening for him is sometimes the track gets a little misaligned in the roadbed or the ties, and the two ends will contact each other. So you'll be getting continuity between two rails, even though they're insulated from one piece of track to the other. Make sure there's a slight, tiny gap between one piece of track and the other. I've seen that happen before.
Okay, Mike was asking, how many M83s or K83s to accommodate 10 turnouts. Really, Mike, it's sort of, it can be guided depending on where your turnouts are. Let's say you have a yard and you've got all your turnouts together. It's more efficient to wire and connect those 4 turnouts to an M83 device because it's local and you don't have a lot of wiring. But let's say you have, you've got a staging yard over here, but then you've got one single turnout that's on the far end of the room. You don't need to, if it's just a single turnout, why connect an M83 to it? You can get what we call an installation decoder and just plug that into that remote turnout. So there's no hard answer how many you need. It's just based on your configuration, what's your convenience of wiring, what's, like optimal for, minimal output of your pocketbook, right? So that's the kind of things you got to factor in. Does CK track cut have to be a certain size? I have quite a bit of false positives. Yeah, false positives.
He's talking about the gap between if he cuts the rails, and they could be buttoned together. Like I said, the 2 rails could be buttoned together, I believe.
Yeah. There are, the thing is, there are a number of instances where you're going to get false readings or double triggers is what I call sometimes, where, your circuits occur twice. That is, so it, again, going back to it, it's like when your wheelbase. So let's say this one piece of track was my contact track, right? And I have a passenger car, well, the passenger car is going to straddle this, right? So that's one issue that you might have. The other issues that you have, and it happens with like rail buses. So I have a VT 11.5 that, you know, it's got a connected wheels, and you've got a traction tire that's extending that wheelbase. In other words, I don't have two bogies that are making contact. I have maybe a bogie, a traction tire, and I have another wheel set from the following passenger car. Well, that traction tire might not be the best trigger contact. So what it's doing is, rather than having a gap that this long, it's actually doubling it to the next contact wheels. So if your rail contact is too short, you've got that straddle situation again. In other words, you got a piece of track that's between wheel contacts. The other instance that I have is what I call the uneven tabletop event. So that's when you have, and I'll just show, I can't show this circuit board, wrong type. So here we have, you know, you've got 2 axles per bogie, right? If you have a 2-axle train, in other words, there's only 1 axle here and 1 axle here, well, you've got 2 issues. If you have an uneven table where one leg is shorter, then what happens is you're lifting up one of those wheels, or one of those wheels is not making solid contact. So you have to be aware of that. And part of what causes that is that you have tension on your 2 couplers, and it's basically pulling any uneven surface flat, and it might be raising that wheel set. And I kind of discovered this in application when I was using it. I said, why was I getting double triggers? And there's different methods to solving that I've used. Sometimes I've made the track section longer. In the instance of the TEE, which was actually causing my turnout to switch tracks, it was derailing all the time. And what I had to do is I actually had to add a completely different contact track to register whether the entire train had passed through that section of track. And that's complex stuff. I won't get into that in detail here. It's something that we can probably cover later, but just be aware that there are instances you have to run the layout to test where things are going. And, you know, it may not be 100%. If you're lucky, yeah, it's great, you know, and it can happen. Let's see. Paul Berry asked, can a contact track be used for 2 functions? Contact, yes. You can double up. You can double up any contact track to be triggered and do 2 different event streams. Just be aware that when you do something like that, you have to think things through and check to see if there's conflicts. So if you have, let's say, one event that's making your turnout go left and you're using the same event without proper conditions to make it go right, you know, you might have this instance where, why is my turnout constantly switching back and forth? Well, it could be those 2 events that are giving opposite controls, but they're being activated by something similar. So the answer to your question is yes, you can make multiple events using the same contact points. Just make sure that your event procedures aren't causing a conflict in actions, because that's going to be, you know, it can be hard to figure out and sort.
Okay, we have a question. Is there a way to sense occupancy based on current draw? That would be the S88 DC, I believe.
Yeah, I believe that is the DC. Yeah, that's a sticky wicket. That one's kind of hard to answer. I believe that's correct though. Current draw on a DC unit, because you can only operate. I don't even know how to answer that. You can't isolate. I think those are the instances where you need a diode. Is that right?
Probably.
You haven't really messed with it enough. So it's been a while since I actually triggered that way. 2 rails.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's not as reliable as a contact track or in our opinion, I believe, it's not as reliable as a contact track or a circuit track or a reed switch.
Okay. let's see. So we have one question. Why are some of the contacts shaded on the CS3 screen? Somebody sent an email. Let me check that email feed and see what it has.
Well, it's one of three colors. It's either gray, yellow, or red.
Yeah, but there is an instance when you have, so the thing is when you're looking at a list of contacts and the label or the name is in gray, it was shown that there's sometimes where it's white. In other words, it doesn't have a gray back. And this is, we're talking about the name
in the article list, and that means it's not on your track diagram.
Yeah, it's not on a track page. So that would be the answer to the question. Can you configure? Okay, so these are answered. I'm going to look through the YouTube view right now. There are some questions on the webinar here. Or are there questions or comments? Checks for wedding together, like just mentioned. When is the contact red? In the instance that I showed earlier, the contact was red because I had actually configured the wrong device. And it didn't have any connection to the CS3 itself. Let's see. Marklin, I think somebody mentioned, I hope somebody bought me the meter. No, that was my own meter. Let's see. Can you show examples of K-track? Unfortunately, I cannot. I don't have any K-track. Lang. So all Marklin lokes in cars must have uninsulated wheels. The freight cars I converted to use on a DCC 2-rail layout with DC Trix wheel sets won't trigger the contact track. Yes, unfortunately, this is correct. In order to have occupancy, or at least successful occupancy, you're going to have to accommodate for any kind of wheels that are insulated, or convert your wheels to non-insulated wheels. And the reverse is true. Obviously, you can't run uninsulated wheels on a 2-rail layout. Otherwise, you'll just short out your system. Can you add a contact section without uprooting sections of the K-track? Rick, why don't you answer that? You got more familiarity with K-track.
Yes, I mean, you would have to get your Dremel onto the layout and cut the track to give you a gap between the two pieces, and then solder a wire and run it down. I would solder it to the inside of the rail and then run it down between the ties underneath the layout. That is one way of doing it. Yeah, it's probably about the only way of doing it. That's kind of a problem. A lot of people get what I call the 8-year-old syndrome, and you just want to see a train run. You lay track, you want to see the train run, and then you're happy with it, and you start doing nailing the track down or scenery, and you realize, well, now I want to do some routing. It'd be nice to sit here and watch the trains rather than control them all the time. And yeah, a lot of people, you have to tear up the track. In C-track, you most definitely have to tear it up. In M-track, I'm sorry, K-track, there is a possibility that you won't have to. So there you go.
Let's see, K-track. Somebody had a question. I forgot what it was here. Okay, Q&A. Let's see. Do I need 2 contract tracks in the station for one long train and one for short trains to make them incomplete sentence? I would imagine stop at a station ramp. Okay, so the question is, do I need 2 contact tracks in the station, one for long trains and one for short trains to make them, I would assume the question is stop or some action at a station ramp. Again, that's a usage issue, depending on what your layout does. 2 things to consider. There's no method that I can be absolutely sure of to get a train to stop at an exact precise location every time. You know, it has to do with variances in train. It has to do variances in drain voltage, depending on using a brake module or just having a train to stop. The way to configure something like that again changes. You can do a two contact track system in a yard. You can probably do this with one contact track if you know how to do it. And part of the solution here is encourage guys play around with this stuff. I mean, it's a hobby. You do this and you figure out where it's going to work and where it's not going to work. And you know, it's the same thing with me. I redesigned the layout, I rebuilt the layout, and I had to sort of run it, figure out where I needed to make adjustments. And then sometimes it involved setting up a new contact track. To solid wire.
We got a question about basically expanding on making a contact track out of an OPC track to solder a wire to it, but it doesn't stick. Well, that's why they give you the tabs on the bottom. The best thing to use is the tabs on the bottom. For one,
those are right.
It's stainless steel wire or rails, so it's going to be hard to get that hot enough where the solder is going to stick without melting the plastic. So use spade connectors and connect to the tabs on the bottom of the track, like Curtis is showing.
Right there. I do it all the time. I usually solder to these tabs. There's a clear picture there. There's a
yes. You're better off soldering to the tabs if you're going to solder than soldering to the rail.
Yeah. Obviously, if you're trying not to lift the track. Yeah, it's usually not a good idea to be soldering to this one. You're going to melt the whole ballast part that's holding onto, because this piece of plastic that's holding it on there, it's very thin. It usually gets clipped when you're trying to connect a K-track to it. Can a turnout be part of a contact track? Yes. Good question.
Well, that really doesn't work that well.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misread that. I was thinking it was a curve, not turnout. Yeah, turnout you can't.
That's about the only track you can't. I've done it, and it basically, there are actually some plastic rails in C-track. K-track, I would have to study it, but I think it would probably not be advised for K-track either, unless you absolutely have to, and then you will have a gap basically between the two contact rails, which are you are making one. There will be an insulated rail in between. So it is possible, but it's not advisable.
The best solder for soldering direct to K-track. Don't really know if I have a solder recommendation. I use electronic solder. It's ideally you want to have a good piece of solder. I don't really have recommendations on solder types, unfortunately. There was a question here. Can you show examples? Well, more or less a comment, and this is what I wanted to get back to. We've shown you basically contact tracks, circuit tracks, and we've talked about reed contacts, which are basically magnetics. But the thing is, these are all getting connected to an S88, and you can use any type of sort of resistance or voltage variance device. In other words, you know, if you know how to do it, you can wire up an opto sensor to it. You can wire a resistance sensor to it. It's just a matter of how it's going to work with your layout. So, and the thing is, there's no hard fast rule of where these apply, but you can be creative with it. So for instance, I had a loop, you know, where you just have things going in circles, and then I had two branch lines for a shuttle track. And what I did was I had a shuttle line. So, you know, again, I have trains going in a loop, right? But I had a shuttle. Rather than the shuttle just going from one end to the other, I wanted to cut over it and go through the loop and then cut back and go on to the other end of the shuttle. And so while I used contact tracks, and I had like maybe one rail bus that I needed to say, hey, this is the shuttle line, that's where I added magnetic reed switches, so that when this particular train that had a magnet on it, I can actually go on an alternate route around the loop and make the shuttle. So, you can be creative with how it works. There's just different solutions on how you want to apply that. So just, things to think about. They're available out there. Is there a good reference book that describes S88 in English? As far as a book topic, I can't really say. This was pretty much, I know I've covered it several times in the digital newsletters. So I would probably look through that. Hopefully, there are a lot of people get a lot out of it. I know sometimes my articles can be over somebody's head because there's a lot of detail that I throw at you. Whether or not it's a great reference for it, but there's no book on the subject alone. Applying it to your layout, as Rick might have mentioned, it really is contingent on your layout and your layout running operation, and all these factors evolve that we can't really cover as a blanket statement. We get comments saying, how do I do this for my layout? It all applies. Direction of travel is everything, whether it's in a yard, whether it's before a signal, whether or not you're trying to control direction, or even so. In some instances, what we do is, and I don't know if Rick ever thought about that, if I control a train that's going into a yard, for instance, that I kind of think of it as a forward motion control. In other words, it's controlling devices in front of the train. In typical block operation, in other words, it's just a loop, I use the reverse. It's controlling what's going on behind that contact track. So it's the things to play around with, and there's differences on how you think about these things because each has a different approach. Obviously, when you have a train running in front, you want to keep the train from behind it from colliding. So you're literally controlling the trailing train. But in a yard, it's a different section. If you've got a train that's going into a yard, you can't control that yard behind that train. It has to control what's in front of it.
All right, we got a question that I'm sorry, I accidentally deleted it and then I didn't know what the question was, but can I configure 2 read contacts to make it directional? Yes, you can. You can put one towards the side of one rail and one towards the side of the other rail, and your magnet on your car or locomotive to the left side or the right side, and that way it will be directional. We actually did something like that on Curtis's first layout, where we had the routing of regular freight and passenger locomotives running through the layout. And then we used read contacts for the rail buses and shuttle lines. So we only needed a magnet on a rail bus, and it would follow a different path in the event script and get to its shuttle line, which crossed through the main line. So it was really fun to watch it go a different route than we programmed the regular trains to go through.
There's a recommendation. Marklin doesn't actually have read switches that I'm aware of.
Yeah, there's read switches. They're
Switches?
I think they work for K and
Yep.
C track. I cannot remember the number right now. Somebody did mention their number 7500 connector for the rails. I believe those are the read contacts.
Yeah, I don't recall seeing that.
I'd have to go through the catalog and see. It's not something that I've looked at frequently.
I'll take a quick look here. Yeah, I just don't recall. I think they had them for K-Track, but I've used, I've gone to an electronics parts store and I've just gotten magnetic reads. They're simple to wire one into the outer rail. Is it the outer rail? And you wire the other into an S88. We do have a question here. Is there any place in the web where your newsletters can be visited and or downloaded? This is from Daniel. Daniel, yeah, we do not actually post them up available for the public to get or access. If you send us an email, we will be happy to send you one. The other way to get them is join the digital club. We usually post a link to that at the bottom of our email replies. There's no fee for the club, and you'll get access. I don't know if they are still doing it, but generally we try to send the archive digital newsletters to any member or new member. That way you have a reference. We have been creating since 2015 when Rick and I started writing the newsletters. We do try to index the articles for speedier access, so you know where to look for those. We can also send those out if you want to send an email to us and request for an index of the articles.
Yeah, usually the January issue will index all the previous year, January, February issue. We actually didn't get it in this year, so 2019 doesn't have an index in the 2020 January, February issue.
And let's see. Yeah, I don't see any reference to a magnetic reed switch in here. All right.
All right. Well, we have a question not regarding the S88s. Can you run a DCC loco and analog on the same track at the same time? No, because there's constant track voltage to the track in digital operation. You won't have any control of the analog locomotive. But what you can do is you can run a DCC loco and an Marklin Motorola loco on the same track at the same time if the DCC loco is set for 3-rail, which means if it has a slider, yes, you can. But then you could get into, depending on how it's wired, like using DC wheel sets and not making contact on the S88 contact track.
Okay, a reed switch contact part is 7555. Thank you, John. And thank you, Mr. Lang. You both sent in the same part number. Okay, so I want to kind of go back on directionality with the reed inputs. Obviously, the circuit track has the flipper on it, which gives you direction. The methods that I've used are, because I use pretty much contact tracks alone. If I have 2 contact tracks this way, you can actually program your events, which we're not going to really go into detail here. Basically, when a train is coming in this direction, it's going to make contact with that. And you can make it say, well, if this hasn't been contact, then you know the train is coming from this direction. The other way, you can flip it around too. If you have a train that's leaving, and it leaves this, it leaves this section of track and is still connected with that, you can actually set up another trigger, which also indicates that the train's going in this direction. And you can flip that around. Hopefully that logic makes sense to you, but it can be done using 2 pieces of track, contact track, reed track, whatever, or even magnetic reed switches. So, all right. Anything else? Don't seem to see any more questions here. Let's kind of go over quickly. Let's go over quickly the trigger types, because I know we'll go over this again, I'm sure, when we do the S88 event scripts. So let me share my screen. Whoops, share my screen. All right, so we're using this screen here as an example. A contact track has what we call, or I'll call 4 states. Okay, so obviously if it's gray, or I shan't say obviously if you don't understand the process, but when it's gray, it means that there is no train on this piece of track. So this is your first state. This is an unoccupied state. When your train first reaches this track, it switches from gray to yellow. And this is what I term as it's a contact trigger. Okay. So it's basically an arrival trigger because the train has now made contact with this train. The beauty of contact tracks is as long as a train or the wheels of this train are on this track, it has an occupied state. In other words, this contact is always going to be yellow. The fourth state is when the train leaves this section of track and it goes from being yellow to going to gray. And this is our second trigger. This is a departure trigger because it goes from gray to yellow. All right, so to reiterate, you have four states. You have two trigger states when a train arrives and when a train departs. And then you have two occupation states, whether or not the train is occupying the track or on occupying track. Okay, so when it comes to event scripting, you can only trigger an event using an arrival or departure state. But you can also use the occupation states to determine things like, is this track line full or is this track available? In other words, you would use this primarily, let's say, in a depot or staging yard or some kind of a staging operation. It is also sometimes it can be applied in block usage, but I'm not going to get into those definitions in this topic because it's covered morely in event scripting. So I think that might be sort of important to know. Now, when you have something like a magnetic reed switch or a circuit track, we don't have these two states of triggering on and triggering off. Is because the slider again is so short that it's almost instantaneous when it goes on and off. And the same thing applies for a magnet, because we don't have long magnets to put under a car, right? And your sliders aren't going to be on every car either. So this is sort of illustrates sort of the benefit of using contact tracks. And again, when I said you can use optical sensors, because that can also do the same thing as an occupation track. As long as that light is blocked, it will probably show occupancy on that rail. So it just depends on which device you connect to the S88. But just be aware that we have these four different states on a contact track, and they can be utilized. You just can't do it with a momentary pulse like a slider would or a magnetic switch would. Okay.
Why don't you show the common problem where people are checking their contacts by clicking on the screen rather than physically checking them? We get this question a lot.
Okay. All right. So let's go back to the screen. Let me go back to that share screen back here. All right. So usually what happens is we will get calls saying, hey, my contacts are working because they're going yellow when I click on them. But when I run my trains, my triggers aren't being activated. Well, the basic problem is this. My cursor's right here. I'm actually clicking on K1, K2 manually. Okay. This is going to activate my event because the event is reading that software. Okay. But what happens is you can't click on this event when you're testing what's going on the layout. And that's similar to what's going on here. Now, my cursor's all the way over here. I'm now controlling the train. The train is what's going to trigger this event. So let's roll this forward. You see, it's the train that's activating. I'm not clicking on it. So that's what Rick is sort of referring to. So there's my train is occupying that piece of track. And now it just left that piece of track. And again, I'm controlling everything on that. I'm not clicking on it manually like I am here now. Okay, so there's a distinct difference, and that just kind of helps sort of the novices who are not really familiar with what's going on with the contact track. This whole pressing of the button is just triggering it manually. And hopefully, was that what you're kind of referring to, or is there something else?
Yeah, people think that their contact is working because they touch it on the screen. Where no, like you said, you're triggering it manually on the screen. You're not actually running a train over the connecting the two rails with the axles of the train, and the color changes on the screen. You have to physically do it with the train to check it.
Okay, we do have a question that should be answered. Sorry, I might have missed the answer. How many Link S88s can be connected to one system? You could probably connect more depending on the outputs that you have on the back. There's no real issue with that because the CS3, if you noticed before, and I'll go to my screen once again, the CS3, frankly, we haven't really tested it because we haven't had the need. We know that we only need one. You only need one S88 link connected to the system. But if you happen to occupy both plugs, I'm sure you could probably utilize it because there's more than one output on there. You just have to make sure you distinguish between whether it's an S88 -1 or S88 -2, because the CS3 will keep track of which one. And I know earlier some guy was referring to wanting some feedback and instructions on the CS2. We'd love to answer that question. It kind of limits us because of setup on the webinars. We have worked with the CS2s extensively since 2015. So a lot of those answers are going to be covered in the newsletters because the procedures are they're different as far as the interface goes. Procedures basically the same. Maybe we'll cover that in another webinar, but we can't really sort of combine those into a single webinar. It really gets overwhelming for us. Hopefully you understand that. So I apologize for not being able to cover all bases. So
yeah, I read that question wrong. I didn't realize link S88s. I thought he meant S88s. And yeah, we don't know how many. We haven't experimented with how many because we don't have access to many. We just use them as we need them. But I'm sure you could get into thousands of contacts in your system by using many S88s. As far as link S88s, you only need one, like Curtis said. You probably can use two, but at that point you're buying, I believe, the more expensive S88 and a power supply for it. So you only really need one, and then you connect S88s, regular S88s, to it after that. So you don't need more than one.
Yeah, and in the off chance you did purchase more than one S88s, depending on the device you have, like the CS3 has 2 ports for it. You can probably plug in 2 ports and they'll have this distinction. I don't remember if I actually shared this screen before, but you just connect them both and you make sure you just make the distinction between whether it's number 1 or number 2 or number 3 or whatever. If you have a terminal box, obviously there's 4 inputs for that. I mean, you can plug in as many S88s as you want, but the issue is, as Rick said, you're buying a power supply for each of those. And you're also buying a more expensive S88 unit. There's no real practical reason why you'd want to do that, especially if you're starting out buying S88s to begin with. And again, just to sort of shorten the topic, if you have a CS3 Plus, you don't need an S88 link. If you have just a CS3, you will need an S88 link first. So. All right, let's see. So there's, please let us know how to make a contact track from K-Track as well. Okay, so if you didn't miss it, the key factor is that, well, and I'll show the rails. C-Track comes with these 2 rails already connected. K-Track does not. Okay, so the thing is, you don't have to worry about insulating this rail from this rail. What we have to be sure you do is you have to make sure you isolate this rail from the 2 outer pieces of track. And there are rail insulators for K-Track. There's no special adaptation that you need to make for K-Track other than the fact that you need to have insulators so that you're not getting a contact from this rail to this rail or this rail to this rail. This center rail has to be isolated from the 2 outside edges, not this one, because they're already separated. Okay,
so we got a question from a gentleman. Using a reed switch as a trigger, how do you prevent it from being triggered multiple times by all the wheel sets on the train? Well, a reed switch is triggered by a magnet, a single magnet on either your car, one of the cars, or the locomotive. And Curtis and I didn't really want to glue magnets to every single locomotive or have a certain car as the end car, so we use contact tracks. What about K-track flex? Yes, flex K-track, again, I believe it's insulated one rail from the other, and you would have to cut either the track in the middle twice to insulate a section of it, or once and insulate it from the next rail to use it as a contact track. Right. Again, the status inquiry. You were on that screen a minute ago for the S88.
Oh, the status inquiry interval in seconds. Okay. All right. You know what? I think it's possible that this interval, this inquiry, yeah, that's a good question. I can't really say exactly what that does. I have never changed that value. It could just be doing a check on the S88s themselves. How often does it refer to the S88 link? But it sounds counterintuitive, especially when you have a cycle bus time. So I think to some degree, rather than complicating what that used for, the simple method is really all you need to do is focus on your cycle time bus, because this interval is how often the S88 or the Link 88 is reading the track.
You're not sharing your screen.
Oh, am I not? Okay, sorry about that. Share, unshare. These guys don't need to see what I'm doing. Okay, sorry. So if you look down here, what he's referring to is, and thanks for asking that question again, he's referring to the info tab, the status inquiry interval this was in 5 seconds. You know, I can only make an educated guess because I don't really mess with this. This could be the interval that the CS checks the validity of the device that's connected to it.
Yeah, and probably the software version.
Yeah.
Update.
Yeah. And so what I was saying earlier is your settings, it just seems like if you have a cycle time here of 100 milliseconds, but you have your status inquiry of 5 seconds, well, you know, you can misinterpret that and think, well, it's only checking the device every 5 seconds. How can my cycle time be faster? And this is where I say, you know what, don't even think or worry about that, because I don't, you know, I haven't touched it. Yeah, you can worry about it and force yourself to look it up. But, you know, the key thing is your cycle time bus is what's going to regulate how often it checks the track. And that's really the critical factor. That's the critical number here. Focusing on the info button, you know, it's just information about the device. It really doesn't have to do with settings on how the device works. And I believe, let's check the TFP, because this,
I think one checks the unit and one checks the cycle time, checks the every contact.
yeah,
When
and
is
I
there a change
believe
in the
that's
contact?
true. I believe that's the same thing. So we even have the same thing in the TFP. So again, the TFP 3 setting, I believe, is the underside setting for a CS3 Plus. I don't think it necessarily applies to a Link S88. And the thing is, or one thing additionally, whenever you do an update to a CS3, it usually involves 2 stages. It does the basic system update, and it's going to give you a subsystem update. And those subsystem updates often come up to, you know, it's either here on the TFP or it's going to be here on the Link S88. Usually I see them on the TFP, which is more or less the CAN bus. But you know, whenever you see an update, after you do an update, check for these subsystem updates, because you know, they do answer some of the questions that we get from users, and it is common to always have a subsystem update. All right, any questions that I'm missing here? Let's stop share. Oh, guys, time is kind of flying here. Do you guys I guess you guys want to open the forum for any kind of random?
Yeah, we can answer. Just take any kind of questions now.
In a bidirectional block in front of a station, how many feedback tracks should I have to make the train stop?
Well, feedback tracks, 2, 1 at each end.
Yeah, if it's bidirectional, you need a feedback. Yeah, you need a feedback track pretty much. And again, it depends on how you want, what your instructions are going to be to that section of track. You want 1 at each end, as Rick states. There are tricky things that you can do, I suppose.
Well, you're getting into a case by case basis per layout. I mean, are you talking? Do you want brake modules so that it down at each end? Do you want 1 brake module so it slows down basically at each end if it's shorter? It's kind of hard to give a global answer to something like that.
Carlos says, are you planning to have a session on programming events? Yes, we're basically the webinars that we're doing, it's a slow progress because there's a lot of information that needs to be done in order to even begin events. In other words, if you don't understand how to add a turnout to your system, and we're going right into events, well, all that's kind of pointless. Also, the other thing is we had to cover sensors first because sensors are what's going to trigger your events. So I believe we're going into what, M84s next?
Yeah, I believe M83s, mostly M84s are basically the same thing. And it's going to be confusing because they are so similar. But M83s are going to probably be a little bit more useful in events because they will trigger turnouts if you use them for turnouts. And that's actually a good question, a good segue, because our next webinar will be October 14th. And I believe it's going to be on M83s and M84s.
Yeah. So, other than that, I think really to cover the event programming, if you want to get immediate information, we'll have to reference the digital newsletters for some older information. The first round of digital newsletters covered the CS2. So it's kind of important, if you guys have CS2s, send us an email. And I know we didn't really, I think we neglected to give you guys the email addresses. It's digital@marklin.com. You can send us an email there. Again, the link to sign up for the digital club is there, and we'll answer your questions as well. And then barring that, I think, so if we're doing an M83 in October, we'll probably start doing basic event scriptings the month after that. Whether or not we get to the advanced stuff, I got to tell you, it's heady stuff. And, I've lost a lot of guys, or had you guys, even though I can't see you, I know your eyes are glazing over.
Yeah, well, here's a quick question to get into the M83 and M84, which, kind of a preview of next webinar. Will the M83, M84 connect to the mobile station? Everybody thinks of it backwards, like the M83 or M84 is you're connecting it to the mobile station. The mobile station is the codes are hardwired into the mobile station. You set the M83 and M84 to the codes on the mobile station. So there's no connection to it now. And again, this is getting into our next webinar. The configuration of the M83 or M84 is easiest done on a central station. And once the mode is set on the M83 and M84, it will continue to perform in that mode on a mobile station. So it may not make sense now, but in the next webinar, it will.
We got a question. How can I download your newsletter? You really don't. We don't have links to download directly. You will receive them when you join the club, or you can request a newsletter article through the web link, and we'll give you a link, and then you can download it there. But we don't have public access to the library. So, what is the proper way to name S88 feedbacks and modules? That's good question. How I tend to reference it is, obviously what really helps definitely is to having, an overall track guidebook where you're going to list your contacts. But you can use the basic protocols that even Marklin has, which is, maybe extend it. The things you want to look out for is, well, what bus number is it? What module is it on that bus line, and what's the contact number? So you can shorten that. You can say, well, bus B123, B1 module M123, and then the contact number itself, K1234. And you can customize it obviously to your language and how you want to look at it. But that's the method sort of I use sometimes, and especially when it comes to events. Because I have different states where I'm using an arrival trigger or a departure trigger. Before I used to, Marklin's changed the names of these features because it is hard to sort of put in one word. They used to call them exit triggers or on-off triggers, but arrival and departure seems to be really stable because then you can list it as, is my event an arrival trigger? Then I'll put those contact numbers and a suffix as A. That way I know it's an arrival trigger. And that's all going to make sense to you when you do event programming, because when you see trains going around and you're troubleshooting, you have to look at it and say, oh, the train is making contact with this, so it's an arrival trigger that I need to look for. Because you could have a lot of scripts. I guarantee you that. A friend of mine sort of did a cycle looping, and he had up to, I think he had 53 scripts. It's a lot of events to go through, so you need to be able to optimize that. One thing I do want to cover before, and this is going to be part of the events programming, we're getting questions as how do I set up contacts to track trains? That currently the existing software, let me shorten this question. The CS3 is near computer-like. So the thing is, when you want to track trains, you actually need a computer program, because the feedback isn't fast enough for the system to say this locomotive is on this section of track. So we can't really program it. Programming like that, there's two methods. Most of what we're showing you is when we want to actually control track events. You kill power to a section of track using an M84, you're basically stopping a train. You switch a brake module, you're basically stopping the train. We're not actually setting a speed train for locomotive to go at 0. So we'll get back to that when we go to event scripting. Just wanted to give you guys sort of a heads up. That's kind of how it all works. Let's see. Is there a way to lengthen the mobile station cable? Yes, there are extension cables for it. I think Rick might be actually looking up the part number for you. I'm running an LGB with the CS3. How many DCC non-MFX decoders? There a good tutorial on modifying my CS3 using modifying my CVs using a CS3. Yes, that is a sort of an advanced question. DCC decoders can be edited through the CS3. Hopefully you already know how to set up your locomotives to use the decoder types to operate through the CS3. Accessing the CS3 or the CVs, you generally are going to have to load maybe a profile during the configuration tab of your locomotive edit window. That's advanced stuff. If you need further detail on that, we might have to answer that in an email for you.
Yeah, and the extension cable, I believe, is 60126 extension cable. I believe it is for the 60145 terminal and also for a mobile station.
All right. Well, it is 12:55 by my computer. Any last questions? Anybody have more questions? Comments about having an extra camera? Yeah, we tried to have it. I tried to load up another camera, but my computer's fighting me on that and won't actually allow me to connect another camera. Obviously, this isn't my train layout room, but it's where my computer is. So there's a disparity between what's going on and what we have to display.
Yeah, and mine is my workshop with a loop of track, and that's it. So, yeah, lots of trains to work on.
All right. So, all right. Well, it looks like you don't seem to be getting any more questions at the place. Well, listen, guys, we really appreciate you joining the presentation. 2 hours, it's a lot to go through. Hopefully you got a lot of good information on that. Obviously, we appreciate your patience when we actually get to event scripting. I know we probably have a lot of readers who want to get into that. But we also know that it's technical stuff, advanced.
Yeah. And people keep sending suggestions on what we should do in a webinar, and we will get to them. Except, like we said, we're trying to do this logically so that people can get to doing event scripts. And we have to cover everything before that. Everything has to be in the central station before that. So we will get to that.
Yeah, is this the back of a clock? I think this is what you're referring to.